Hello everyone and happy holidays. If you are returning, thank you for returning, and if you are just joining me and this is your first video, I thank you for clicking on it. So today's video I'm going to show you 4 different side dishes that you can do, all vegan, completely vegan, and then one dessert, and then one side dish that I made that didn't turn out the way it was supposed to, and I'll tell you why, but I didn't include it in the footage that I'm showing you right now. So the first side dish was these vegan rolls, and in the recipe that I had, it said to not proof the yeast and to add the salt with the yeast to combine everything like you can see me doing right here. And I've made bread quite often. I make it probably once or twice a week. And I knew going into this that if I put the salt in with the yeast and the flour, and if I didn't proof my yeast, it was more than likely gonna kill the yeast because salt kills yeast. But the recipe had a lot of good reviews, so I figured I was gonna go ahead and do it. But these were a total fail. They didn't rise at all. And so I'm gonna leave the recipe down below, but I recommend not to follow the instructions and to proof your yeast before you start in the coconut milk that you put in with it. To warm the coconut milk up, put the yeast in there, stir it around, wait 10 minutes, and then dump the coconut milk and the yeast into the flour, and then stir it to combine, let it combine for a minute or two, pour the oil in, let that combine, and then pour the salt in and let it knead for anywhere from 5 to 6 minutes, or until the bowl, the sides of the bowl are clear. And it can stick to the bottom of the KitchenAid bowl, that's fine, but it cannot touch the sides, and then you should have no problems and you can follow the recipe step by step afterwards. But do not do what she says. You need to proof the yeast. That's the only way this will work, because the salt will kill the yeast if you do not proof it and if you add them both at the same time. And I also had to add probably an extra 3 teaspoons of the coconut milk, because it was not coming together like it should, so just pay attention to that when you make this recipe. So next up is these scalloped potatoes. I went ahead and used the remainder of the coconut milk from the rolls because I just wanted to get rid of it, and you need unsweetened milk anyways. And then I used about 4 pounds of this 5-pound bag, and I left probably 2 or 3 potatoes in there, and it was the perfect amount. So what you're going to do first off is you're going to soak your cashews, because it helps them open up, and basically you won't get such a gritty sauce, and then it also helps with digestion. You'll be able to digest them a lot easier. So basically you're just going to cut your potatoes with a mandolin, and it was really easy. However, these potatoes were so time consuming. It took me, I think, probably 45 minutes to cut all the potatoes and peel them, because you have to be really careful when you get to the end, otherwise you will take a chunk out of your finger off. And I went ahead and I soaked my potatoes in some ice cold water while I finished them and made my sauce, because I just always do that when I make fries, because it helps remove the starch so they won't turn brown. It's not in the recipe instructions, but I went ahead and did anyways. So then you're just going to cut up an onion, just thinly sliced, along with a couple cloves of garlic, and saute it in a little oil or water. And you're going to put that on the on top of the first layer of potatoes that you do. So then after you're all done, you just assemble your sauce mixture, just some cashews, water, or vegetable broth, nutritional yeast, the unsweetened milk. I used half coconut and half soy, just like I said earlier, to get rid of the coconut milk. And I ended up adding about, I think, a 1/4 cup more of the nutritional yeast than the recipe called for. So basically you're just going to put down a layer of your potatoes, about half of them, and then you're going to put down the sauteed onions and garlic, along with half of your sauce mixture. And then you're going to put down the other half of the potatoes and cover it with the rest of your sauce mixture. I ended up using all of it. However, I didn't need to, and I probably shouldn't have. So just pay attention to that. Make sure it's not getting too full to where it will bubble over like mine did. Then you're gonna bake this at 400 degrees for about an hour, and then you're gonna check it, and if the potatoes aren't fork tender, so if they're not completely done, bake it for an extra 10 minutes, check it again. If it's not done, bake it for another 10 minutes, and it should be done by then. Next up, we have one of my personal favorites, green bean casserole. And because the canned cream of mushroom that you get at the store contains milk, I ended up having to make my own, and it was a million times better than the store brand. Like, this is something that I would have eaten all of it with a spoon if I could. It was that good. So basically, you just want to chop an onion up really, really fine. You want to dice it really, really fine because you want it to basically melt into the sauce. So that way you don't have chunks of onion in it. And then the mushrooms, when you cut them, you can do like some dice, some big chunks, like cut some of them and then dice some of them to have kind of a mixture of sizes of mushrooms in the sauce. And then of course the garlic you want to mince up. So I ended up adding a half a teaspoon of thyme and a half a teaspoon of sage after the onions and the mushrooms were completely cooked down and soft. And then I added 3 tablespoons of flour, and I let that mix around and cook to get the flour taste out and to completely cook the flour. And while that was cooking, I went ahead and blended up the cashews and a cup of vegetable broth, which made basically cashew milk. And then once the flour was completely cooked, I went ahead and grabbed a whisk and gradually incorporated about a cup of vegetable broth. And then once that was thick and bubbling, I went ahead and added another cup and basically just whisked that to make sure that I didn't have any lumps. And then once that came to a boil, I added the homemade cashew milk. And once it was thickened to my liking, I went ahead and turned the heat off and let it cool. And that is your completed cream of mushroom dish. I think I added a little bit more salt and that was it. So for the actual casserole part, you're only going to need about 10 ounces of the mushroom soup, and then you're going to mix everything in a casserole dish. So you're going to mix the cream of mushroom, 3 cans of green beans, anywhere from 2 to 3 cans of green beans, about a third a cup of the French's onions, and a 3/4 of a cup of milk, and you're gonna whisk that all together and bake for 25 minutes at 350 degrees. And then once it's done, you're gonna take it out of the oven, top it with another about 2/3 cup of onions, or just the rest of the package like I did, and bake for another 5 minutes until the onions are golden. And that is your completed cream of mushroom dish. So this acorn squash recipe I came up with all on my own. I basically cooked my acorn squash in the oven until they were fork tender, and then I cooked the rest of the package of mushrooms, cooked an onion, I sauteed them in a little bit of oil, and then I added probably half a can of chickpeas. I made my own fresh that morning, I always do, from dry. Added in a handful of walnuts, chopped walnuts, 3 or 4 cloves of garlic, 3 handfuls of spinach, and I let that all wilt down. And then once the spinach was wilted, I added in about probably a third a cup of the cranberries, and I just let that heat up. And I added in a cup of brown rice, or a cup of dry rice cooked. So whatever a cup of dry rice cooked is, I added that in, mixed it all together, threw it back in the cooked acorn shells, and put it in the oven for about 15 minutes, basically to warm everything up, and combined it. And then that's it. Next up is the vegan stuffing. It had a really good taste, but it was still kind of mushy in the center when we were done. So I think that we didn't cook it long enough, but we cooked it for about 10 more minutes than the recipe said. So I don't know if that's just how the recipe was supposed to be, or if that was an error on our part, but it still tasted good in the end. So basically you're just gonna cut up an onion and a stalk of celery and then saute it in some oil. Once those are soft, you're gonna add in a chopped apple and saute it until that's soft. And then once that's soft, you're going to add your spices that I showed in the beginning. I think I added a teaspoon of each, and then let that cook for a minute or two. And then you're gonna add in your bread. I added in probably 2 cups of bread at a time, and then a cup of vegetable broth, and then stir it until it's combined and kind of cooked down. And then just repeat those steps until you're out of bread and vegetable broth. You should run out of vegetable broth at the same time you run out of the bread. And then you're just going to cover it with foil, cook it for 10 minutes at 350, take the foil off and cook it for an additional 10 minutes. And last but not least, we have a vegan pumpkin pie. So basically you're not switching anything from a regular pie recipe except for the silken tofu that will take the place of the eggs. I did make my own pie crust, except I didn't film it, and I'm going to link the video down below where I got the pie crust from, but it is a vegan pie crust because it uses butter flavored shortening instead of butter. So basically you're just going to mix all your ingredients in a blender, blend it up, and pour it in your pie crust. It could not be easier. And I like this recipe. I probably would have changed one thing, and that was I would have done probably maybe a 1/4 teaspoon less of the cinnamon, and I would have added maybe a 1/2 teaspoon of pure maple syrup. I feel like that would have been really, really nice. And I didn't end up using that flour that I showed in the beginning. I was just too lazy to move it out of the shot. And then you're just gonna bake this uncovered at 350 degrees for 45 minutes, and then after 45 minutes stick a toothpick in the middle of it and it should come out almost clean. You should have a little bit left on the toothpick, or alternatively you can jiggle the pie a little, and it shouldn't jiggle at all. It should be completely set. And then we went ahead and let it rest in the fridge overnight and tried it the next day, and it was amazing. It was probably the best pumpkin pie I've ever tasted. But that recipe brings this video to a close. I want to thank all of you who have watched it, and if you try a recipe from it, let me know in the comments down below what you thought of them. And if you have a friend who's looking for any vegan things or vegan Christmas options, why don't you direct them over? I'm sure they'd love the inspiration, and I would love to have them over here. I want to thank you again and hope you all have a very Merry Christmas.